She had been in the territory for 3 weeks when she first knew she was being watched. The tracks were there when she woke, boot prints in the red dust at the edge of camp, unhurried, close enough that whoever left them had stood near enough to see her sleeping. The prints came from the north, from the direction of the canyon ridgeline, and they went back the same way. No other sign, no disturbance, nothing taken, just the evidence of a man who had come, looked, and decided to leave without announcing himself either way. Clara Marsh sat on her bedroll with her coffee going cold in her hand and studied those tracks for a long time. She was 34 years old. She had driven her father's wagon from Missouri to Arizona territory alone, had navigated the last 40 miles of red rock scrubland on a map her father drew from memory 20 years ago, and had made her camp at the spring he had left her, a proper spring, year-round water, the kind that in this country was worth more than anything man-made. She had come to see if the land was worth staying for. She had not yet decided. The tracks were the size of a working man's boot. Even and careful, the stride said someone who moved through country like this the way water moves, following the path of least resistance, taking no more space than necessary. She looked at them a while longer. Then she stood up and made a new pot of coffee. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe to The Hidden Acre, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. There's something about a frontier love story that finds exactly the people who need it. Let's see who's here. By noon, there was firewood, dry mesquite, cut to fire length, stacked neatly on the north side of the camp, where the rock shelf would shelter it from the wind. She had not heard an axe. She had not heard anything at all. She stood looking at the stack for a while. Then she left it the way she found it and used it that night to make the best fire she had managed since leaving Missouri. The land her father had left her was called the Coldwater Parcel on the original deed, a name she had thought was about the spring until Senora Velis at the trading post in Caliche Spring told her it wasn't. Caliche Spring was 15 miles west, a settlement that had managed to become a town by the specific frontier method of enough people arriving in the same difficult place and deciding it was too far to leave. It had a trading post run by a man named Briggs who extended credit to people he approved of and withheld it from people he didn't, which in practice meant he extended it to men and to women who came accompanied by men, and withheld it from women who arrived alone with clear eyes and no visible need of anyone's opinion. Clara had introduced herself, stated her business plainly, and bought what she needed with cash. Senora Velis kept a different kind of operation, a 2-room adobe at the edge of the settlement where she grew chiles and kept chickens and sold eggs and coffee to people Briggs had decided not to deal with. She had been in the territory since before most of the Anglo settlers were born. She knew who owned what, and which claims were honest, and which springs ran year-round, and she had known Clara's father by letter and by the reputation of a man who paid what he owed. When Clara described the tracks to her, Senora Velis looked up from her coffee cup. "That would be Nate Coldwater," she said, not in the way of gossip, in the way of a woman stating a cardinal direction. Nate Coldwater, half Apache on his mother's side, raised between two worlds in a way that meant both claimed him and neither entirely did. He tracked for the Army when they needed him and wanted to admit it. He tracked missing persons, located water, read country the way other men read print, fluently, quietly, without a need to tell anyone what the words said. He had worked these particular canyons for 20 years, and there was not a ridge or a spring or a dry wash in 100 miles that he did not know. "He's not dangerous," Senora Velis said. And then, after a pause, "Not to you." Clara thought about that on the ride back to her land. She thought about the careful tracks, the unhurried stride, the firewood stacked where she needed it without being asked. She thought about a man who saw a woman alone at a spring in the backcountry and left firewood instead of trouble. She decided to stay for at least the summer. The land rewarded her for the decision. The spring was good, better than the deed described, the water cold and consistent, the soil around it richer than the surrounding rock flats. Her father had known what he was doing when he filed that claim, even if he had never managed to come and work it himself. There was a flat rise to the northeast that looked built for a structure, the way certain pieces of ground seemed to have been waiting for a particular thing to be set on them. She started clearing brush. She walked the fence lines, such as they were, old stakes and dry rot. Not much left. She cataloged what needed doing and decided where to begin. She went into Caliche Spring for supplies twice in those weeks. She was aware of how the town looked at her, not with hostility exactly, but with the specific measuring gaze of a community that had already opened a category for her and was watching to see whether she would fit into it or require adjustment. Op Briggs watched her from behind his counter with the expression of a man waiting to be proven right. Two women at the Sunday gathering were friendly in the careful way of women who hadn't yet decided whether she was worth the investment of real friendliness. A man named Raymond Cale, a wide man from Tucson with a linen suit and the manner of someone accustomed to having things work out in his direction, introduced himself outside the trading post and expressed his interest in her land with a pleasantness that had very little warmth in it. "Beautiful parcel," he said. "That spring is the finest water source in a 30-mile radius. Be ashamed to see it go undeveloped." "It won't," Clara said, and went to get her horse. She did not think much more about Raymond Cale that day. She was thinking about the fence lines and about what lumber would cost and about the way the canyon below the spring turned gold in the late afternoon in a way that was almost indecent in its beauty, in the way only difficult country can be beautiful. Nate Coldwater appeared on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of her third week. She was setting a post, or trying to. The ground at the northeast corner of her intended fence line was rocky in a specific and stubborn way, and she had been fighting the same hole for the better part of an hour, making no progress worth describing. She heard nothing. She simply looked up, and he was there, 30 feet away, standing at the edge of the scrub oak in the way she was starting to understand was his particular manner of arriving, present without performance, simply there. He was tall and lean in the way of men who move through country rather than across it. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that had absorbed a great deal of weather and given nothing back. He looked at her and at the post and at the ground she had been fighting, and he walked over and held out one hand for the mallet. She gave it to him. He drove the post into the ground in 3 strikes, finding the gap in the rock that she had not found in an hour, and handed the mallet back. She said, "You left the wood." He had started to turn away. He stopped. He did not turn back around. "There's a better campsite," he said, "above the spring. The wind runs east to west through that draw. Where you're camped, it'll be bad come August." "I'll move before August," she said. He looked at the post she had just set, the first one in a fence line that would take many more to finish. "Will you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. He walked away through the scrub oak and was gone before she put the mallet down. Senora Velas, when Clara reported this conversation, sat for a moment and then said, "That is a long conversation for him." He came back. Not every day, not on any schedule she could predict. But he came back, and each time there was something done when he left that had needed doing, a post set, a section of fence tightened, once a section of the old stone foundation at the northeast rise cleared of rubble in a way that showed her how the original structure had been laid, which told her something useful about how to build what she intended to build. He spoke rarely and with great economy. She learned to listen to what he didn't say as much as what he did. He had a way of telling her what the land could do and what it couldn't without framing it as advice. He simply described what he observed and left her to draw her own conclusions, which she found she preferred to most kinds of help she had been offered in her life. On the evenings when he stayed past the day's work, she talked and he listened. She told him about Missouri, about her husband who had died of fever 3 years back, about her father who had filed this land claim with the intention of coming out himself and had instead died in his bed in Hannibal with the deed on the table beside him, about the particular quality of having nothing left to lose and what it felt like when it stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like something else entirely. He listened in the real way, not waiting for her to stop so he could speak, but actually receiving what she said. It took her a while to understand the difference. Most people listen the first way. She had stopped expecting the second. She found out about his wife from Senora Velas, not from him. A young woman, Apache, dead in childbirth 18 years ago. A grief he had not put down so much as built around, the way you build a house around a spring, working with what is there because there is no other option. She thought about that for a long time at her fire. She noticed, as the weeks went on, that her camp was always stocked with what she had not cut herself. that the trail from a spring to her camp had been cleared of loose stone without her seeing it done, that when her bay mare came in limping one afternoon, Nate appeared within the hour and examined the hoof quietly and removed a cactus thorn she would have missed, and the horse stood for him the way horses stand for people they have already decided are safe. She noticed that he watched the horse the way she watched him, careful and patient, taking in information that would matter later. In October, Raymond Cale came back. He came with a lawyer this time, a small, precise man from Tucson who arrived with a document that claimed to establish a prior land filing on Clara's parcel, dated several months before her father's deed, which Cale claimed to have purchased from the original filer, who had since died and left no other heirs. The filing was with the Territorial Land Office. There would be a hearing in Tucson in 6 weeks. She was invited, which was to say, she had better be there. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from the Hidden Acre. The best ones are still coming. And the people who watch all the way to the end are exactly the ones who understand what these stories are really about. She rode to Caliche Spring with the document in her saddlebag and found that the news had preceded her, the way news does in small settlements where there are too few people and too many idle hours. Aunt Briggs declined to extend her credit on a supply order she had been counting on. 2 women she had thought were becoming friendly did not meet her eyes outside the church. It was done quietly and without declared malice, which was its own kind of cruelty, the kind that doesn't have to answer for itself because it never admitted to doing anything at all. Senora Velas poured her coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Cale has bought 3 other springs, 2 of them with claims like this one. Both hearings went his way." A pause. Both were heard in Tucson. "I have my father's original deed," Clara said. "I know it." Another pause. "You'll need someone who knows the land, the spring, the boundaries, someone who can speak to what they're worth in terms the land office understands." Clara looked at her coffee. "He won't be received well in Tucson," she said. Senora Velas did not answer immediately. When she did, she said no, he won't. And then, after another pause that held a great deal that neither of them needed to say aloud, "He'll know that." She found Nate at the old cottonwoods north of her camp, 3 miles up the canyon where Senora Velas had told her he sometimes sheltered when the territory brought him this direction. She rode up and dismounted and said his name and waited. He turned from whatever he had been reading in the ground. Some conversation the land was having with itself that she could not yet hear, though she was beginning to learn the language. She told him about the hearing, about the competing claim and Cale's lawyer and the 6 weeks she had before Tucson, about what she needed, not to win it necessarily, but to have someone stand in that room who knew what they were talking about, who could speak to the spring and the land boundaries with the authority of someone who had walked every inch of this country for 20 years. He was quiet for a long time. She had learned what his silences meant by now. This one meant he was deciding something, and that the deciding was not easy. "Cale's man shot my horse last April," he said finally. "Filed a complaint with the Territorial Office in Tucson." Another pause. They didn't hear it. She understood what he was saying. If he came to that hearing, his history with Cale was already known, and his testimony would be dismissed before he gave it, and it might damage her case rather than help it. He was not telling her this to refuse. He was telling her the truth so she could decide with the full information in front of her. That was what he always did. She had come to depend on it more than she would have thought possible 3 months ago. She looked at him for a while. "I didn't ask you to win it," she said. "I asked you to come." He looked at her in the way he had that she had learned was his equivalent of many other men's more visible reactions, taking in something that mattered and not letting it go. Then, when do we leave? They rode to Tucson on a cold morning in late October with the sky the color of old pewter above the canyon walls. The hearing was in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular kind of authority that is not earned but inherited. Cale's lawyer had a leather case and a press suit. Clara had her father's deed, a survey she had paid Caliche Springs part-time assayer to draw, and Nate Coldwater standing at her left side in his good coat, dark wool, carried with the quiet dignity of something that had been used hard and maintained carefully. The lawyer for Cale established the prior filing, the purchase, the succession. It It was professional work. Clara presented her father's deed and the survey without apology. She answered the judge's questions in the direct, measured way she had answered most things in the territory. As a woman who had decided that performing uncertainty was a luxury she could not afford and never have been able to. Nate testified about the spring, its location, its output by season, the geological markers that corresponded with the landmarks in her father's deed and contradicted the boundaries described in Cale's filing by enough that the contradiction was visible without expertise to see it. He spoke with the precision of a man describing something he knew the way most people know their own names, not because he had studied it, but because he had lived it for 20 years, in all weathers, in all seasons, going and coming back. He was not emotional. He did not claim expertise he did not have. He simply said what he knew, as clearly as he could, in language a land office could follow. Cale's lawyer attempted to establish a conflict of interest. He named Nate's Apache heritage, his freelance work for the Army, his presence on the plaintiff's land over the preceding months. He did this in a way that was not quite a question and not quite an accusation, but was entirely clear in its intention. Nate looked at him without expression. "You can ask me about the land," he said. "You seem to know a good deal about the man. You don't seem to know anything about the land." The lawyer pressed on. The judge listened. Clara sat still and looked at her hands on the table and did not look at Nate because she understood that looking at him now would be the same as flinching, and she was not going to flinch. The judge, who was not an entirely corrupt man, which in Tucson at that time was its own kind of achievement, looked at the survey and the deed and the competing filing for a long time. He asked 3 questions that were specific and quiet and suggested he had read the documents more carefully than Cale had expected. He did not look at Nate when he deliberated. He looked at the documents. He ruled for Clara. They walked out of the courthouse into a street where the cold had sharpened since morning, the kind of dry November cold that arrives in Arizona like a decision rather than a gradual change. Cale's lawyer said something from the top of the courthouse steps, directed at Nate, loud enough to carry to the people on the street. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. She turned around. She said, not loudly, but clearly, so that the men on those steps and the people passing below them all heard it plainly. "This man knows this territory better than anyone in that room today, including your client. I'll be careful how you speak about him." She did not wait for a response. She walked down the steps. Nate walked beside her. They reached the horses, and she untied hers, and he untied his, and they rode out of Tucson together in the direction of home, into a late afternoon that had turned copper and cold and very wide above the desert. They did not speak much on the ride back. But near dusk, when they made camp at a dry wash, Nate found the way he found everything. Without consulting anything but the land itself, she noticed that the fire she reached for her kit to build was already laid. The wood was cut and placed in the order it needed to be in. She looked at him across the dark space between them. "You did it again," she said. He looked at the fire and nodded her. "The draw catches dry wood when the wind runs west," he said. "You'd have found it." She knew enough by now to understand what he had not said, and what the saying of it would have cost him, and why he chose the other way instead. She put the match to the kindling, and the fire took, and they sat with it until the cold forced them to their bedrolls, and the territory was quiet around them in the specific way it got quiet out here, not empty but full of things that were not people. They came back to Caliche Spring on a Saturday in late November. Some things had shifted and some had not. Ott Briggs extended her credit again, which was commerce more than conscience, and they both understood it. The 2 women from the church were friendly with the tentative quality of people who have reconsidered a position and are still deciding how to acknowledge the reconsideration. A rancher's wife named Della Pace, who had been quietly decent to Clara throughout, looked at her when she walked in alongside Nate and said simply, "Good to see you back." In context, that was considerably more than it appeared. Senora Velas had coffee ready, as if she had known they were coming, which she probably had. She looked at them both and said nothing at all, and that was nearly everything. Winter settled over the land. The spring ran cold and steady through December and January. Clara moved her camp to the site above the draw, the one Nate had told her about in October, and began planning the structure in earnest. She had her father's deed clear, the spring hers, the boundary markers recorded. She had enough to work with. He appeared most mornings. Not always. He had his own work, his own movements through the territory, and she understood he was a man who needed the country the way some people need solitude, and that asking him to be still would be asking him to be something he wasn't. But most mornings when the work was on, they worked. She hauled stones for the foundation. He knew how to read rock the way a builder reads lumber, which pieces would bear weight and which wouldn't, which courses would sit flat and which needed attention. He did not explain what he was doing. He showed her, and then he expected her to do it. And when she did it wrong, he said so plainly, and when she did it right, he moved on without comment, which she had come to understand was his highest form of approval. They ate together at the fire when the day was done. Sometimes she talked, and he listened. Sometimes neither of them talked. The silences were the kind that take time to build. They don't arrive at the beginning of things. They come after enough words have been exchanged that the absence of words means something instead of nothing. She thought about Missouri sometimes, about the life she had left there, and found it increasingly difficult to imagine going back. Not because the territory was easy. It was not easy. It was cold and rocky and remote and occasionally hostile in both its climate and its people. But she had built something. She was still building it. And there was a man beside her who found firewood at dawn and left it without being asked, who came when she asked him to come, who spoke the truth in a Tucson courthouse without apology, and who had never once, not once, told her what she could or couldn't do with her own land. She thought about his wife sometimes, the one who died 18 years ago, and about the particular kind of loneliness that is given up expecting to end. She thought about her own 3 years since her husband, and how she had grown so accustomed to carrying things alone that she had stopped noticing the weight. She noticed it now. She noticed it most clearly in those moments when she didn't have to carry something alone, when a post was set before she reached for the mallet, when a section of wall was leveled before she had finished thinking about how to level it, when the fire was laid at the dry wash outside Tucson, and she had not asked for it and did not need to. On a morning in late February, she was laying stone for the north wall, and he was working the grade of the adjacent course when she said, without looking up, "My father's deed has room for another name on it." She kept working. The stone she was placing was a flat piece of sandstone that fit the course exactly, and it deserved the attention. He was quiet. She could hear him working, the careful sound of stone placed with intention. Then he said, "I've been in this territory a long time." "I know it," she said. "No one's asked me to put my name on anything in it." She looked up then. He had both hands on the stone he had just placed, and he was looking at it, not at her. His face was doing what it always did, receiving something, deciding what to do with it, giving nothing back that he had not thought through first. She said, "I'm asking." He looked at her then. What was in his face at that moment, she kept to herself. It was not meant for anyone outside that unfinished wall, that cold February morning, that particular piece of country with the spring running clear below them and the canyon walls cutting the sky into clean angles of blue. After a while he said, "I'll go speak to the Reverend." She nodded. They both went back to work. The deed was amended in March, in the Caliche Spring land records, in the spare handwriting of the county clerk who said nothing about it and wrote both names in the same ink, as he always used, and moved on to the next transaction. Nate Coldwater and Clara Coldwater, formerly Marsh. The spring on the parcel had been called Coldwater long before either of them knew what the name would come to mean. The house was finished that spring. 4 rooms, stone and timber, with a porch that faced east so the morning came in level and clean, the way Nate had said it would. The spring ran beneath the north side of the structure, as it always had, cold and steady, with no interest in what had been built above it. Ott Briggs extended credit without being asked. Della Pace came to see the house and brought a jar of preserves and said it was fine construction, which from a rancher's wife was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Senora Velas came on a Wednesday and sat on the porch and drank her coffee and looked at the canyon and said, "Your father would be satisfied." Clara thought that was probably true and probably an understatement. The woman in Caliche Spring who said what other people only thought, a woman named Johanna Pruitt who had watched Clara with the particular skepticism of someone who believes the world runs better with its categories intact, stopped her outside the church one Sunday in April and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been revised by events. "You've done well with it," she said, meaning the land, possibly meaning more than the land. Clara said thank you, and she meant it because by now she had enough to be generous with. The territory had opinions. It always would. About a woman alone who had stayed. About a man of two worlds who put his name on a deed alongside hers. About two people who built something in the high desert backcountry and did not explain it to anyone, because the land itself had been the answer and the land had already said all there was to say. Some mornings Clara still woke at dawn and lay still for a moment before she opened her eyes, and there was a second, just a second, when she was back in that first camp, the red dust tracks at the edge of her bedroll, the cold coffee, the question of who had come and why, and what they had decided about her. A woman alone at a spring at the edge of everything, deciding whether to stay. And she heard his boots on the porch boards, the sound the house had learned before she did. The smell of the fire he had started before she woke. The morning coming in through the east window the way he had said it would, level and clean across the kitchen floor. She had come to the territory to see if the land was worth staying for. She was still here. She was still deciding. That was, she had come to understand, not a failure to conclude, but the whole point. Two people on a piece of difficult ground, choosing it again every morning, choosing each other in the ordinary and irreversible way of people who have stopped pretending they might leave. The spring ran. The canyon walls went gold in the afternoon. The tracks in the red dust at dawn were his, and she knew it, and she left the coffee on the fire so it would be warm when he came back. That was enough. That was everything. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who feel it and the ones who share it. If this one stayed with you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another story about two people on the frontier who found each other when they'd stopped expecting to. And we tell those stories here at the Hidden Acre.